Wine, a lens to view poetry. Throughout this project, I'll be focusing on the role wine played throughout Chinese poetry, using the works of poets such as Du Fu, Li Bai, Tao Yongming, Ru Jiang, and Ji Kang as a lens through which to view it. These poets spanned different historical periods, ranging from the Tang, the Jin dynasty, and the late Eastern Han dynasty, as well as the Three Kingdoms period, and all of which were known to be strongly associated with wine. Through this analysis, we'll explore how Li Bai's vitality contrasts with Du Fu's melancholic style, how Tao Yongming found comfort alone in nature, and how Ran Ji and Ji Kang embodied Taoist thought throughout their life and poetry. All of which comes with one single goal, and that is to review the importance of wine in Chinese culture and literature, and to demonstrate how it serves as a symbol, image, metaphor, partner, and quasi-divine inspiration, if you will, for these poets. Li Bai, also known as Li Po, was a prominent Chinese poet of the Tang dynasty, as well as one of the most famous poets, if not the most famous poet, throughout all of Chinese history. Living from 701 to 762 AD, he spent most of his life traveling across mainland China, and as such, his poems often reflect his sense of freedom and carefree happiness. One of Li Bai's most well-known poems, Drinking Alone in the Moonlight, discusses himself sitting amongst the flowers by himself, with only the moon and shadow to keep him company. Immediately here, we see that Li Bai takes a solitary approach to his celebration of life through wine. As we see in the first line, he takes his wine jug amongst the flowers, choosing to drink alone rather than with his friends, and he raises his cup to the moon to share a moment with both the moon and his shadow. In doing so, he anthropomorphizes them and reflects his profound connection to nature with specifically celestial bodies. However, in the fifth line, he clearly points out that the moon doesn't drink, showing that he needs to drink the wine in order to get to the same level of transcendence and connection with the way that the moon already possesses. Additionally, he reflects upon his life of travel and his way of following the Tao as a happy wanderer. Lastly, Li Bai brings about the discussion of the shortness of life. He first mentions how he will travel the moon and shadow, happy to the end of spring. Whereas here we can see that the end of spring represents the end of one life and the beginning of another life across a lot of Chinese poetry. And we see that the Milky Way represents temporary separation versus the eternal reunion that we see in the Milky Way, as is represented in Chinese mythology. The second poem I chose from Li Bai's Corpora is Before the Cask of Wine. In this second poem, Li Bai celebrates life by using wine as a metaphor, with the spring wind and the golden bowl of wine and falling flowers all symbolizing the fleeting nature of time. Despite the inevitability of growing old quickly and dying, Li Bai encourages a joyous appreciation of life's fleeting beauty. In this poem, we see the return of that motif I mentioned earlier with spring. So as spring wind comes from the east quickly and passes, it's mentioning how time is moving so quickly, but it only leaves faint ripples in the wine. Now this implies that wine is, one, that it literally ages well and doesn't immediately die with age like humans do and like all biological beings do, but rather that it has this immortal aspect to it, that it has this power to bring back your youth for a limited time, by way of removing the ailments and cares you have from old age. In this, he closes by saying more or less the same lines of Carpe Diem. You must recognize your fleeting youth, live and drink wine and be joyous, and this is the way to be one with the Tao. Du Fu was another poet of the Tang period and potentially the only poet in Chinese history to rival Li Bai. Living from 712 to 770 AD, Du Fu grew up the son of a scholar official and a noble, and as such, he was educated to become a civil servant, unlike Li Bai. This is a background, of course, that was heavily influenced by Confucianism rather than that of Taoism. This brings us to our first poem by Du Fu, a second farewell to Governor Yen Wu at the Fenji Post Station. Here we can clearly see Du Fu express his sadness over his departed friend, and how wine is used to commemorate their bond, and how it was used as a celebration of them being together, and how now the lack of it, and thus the lack of his friend as well, brings him back to the typical Du Fu that people know him to be as a very sad and expressively tormented poet. In his next poem, Alone, Looking for Blossoms Along the River, Du Fu brings back the more escapist and sorrowful nature that people expect from him, as compared to the last poem, which is recognizing the celebration of bonds that they had. Here we can clearly see the flip side, which is, of course, his complaint and his sorrow. We see in the very first stanza, with his friend and wine gone only 10 days, he's gone half crazy, he's losing it, he's very upset with himself. Mainly because, of course, his time is passing. He's in full fear of spring, that same motif we've discussed with Li Bai. And it's because of this fear of spring that he indulges in his wine. And so, with this wine, he bids life's affairs bon voyage, which I'm sure is just a translational artistic liberty, because I doubt Du Fu would be writing bon voyage, which is French, of course. But he uses this wine to avoid the pain of realizing that his life is moving onwards, and he's getting old. Whereas we see with Li Bai this acceptance of age, and we drink wine to become more one with nature and one with this moving time, we see the converse here with Du Fu. We see he's actually saying, I'm drinking wine to disturb the flow of nature that he mentions with East of the River in stanza 4 and 5. We see he clearly isn't with the flow of nature. He's saying, no, blossoms, please slowly fall. Open sparingly and open delicately. I'd like to have more time. This is, of course, because the blossoms represent spring and that passing of time, that coming of death. Another poet who was famous around this time was Tao Yuanming. Born in 372 and dying in 427, his poetry didn't get quite famous until the end of the Tang Dynasty, although he wrote it hundreds of years before. Tao Yuanming wrote many poems while drinking wine. Of these poems, there's a small collection aptly named Poems While Drinking Wine, all of which are numbered 1 through 20. The first of which, Poems While Drinking Wine 1, discusses a balance that exists within the natural world. Using this balance, Tao Yuanming suggests that one should not try to sway it in one direction or the other, but should just accept it as it is. The key moment of this poem obviously being, intelligent men understand and are beset no more with doubts. Basically, Tao Yuanming is suggesting that the intelligent man understands that there is no given truth and there is no set way something should be or is, and that everything is subject to change. So whereas an unintelligent man would drink to forget the ups and downs, the intelligent man simply accepts whatever life has to offer through wine. While this is somewhat agreeable to the teachings of Li Bai in his poetry, as where you should drink wine and become one with the world the way it is, fairly agreeable, it completely opposes what Du Fu does and suggests in his poem, which is drinking to forget negative effects, such as, of course, the passing of time and growing old, which he fears so greatly. So whereas Li Bai might suggest a more embracing the world the way it is, an exuberance to be happy about it, Tao Yuanming suggests more so take a stoic approach and just accept fate the way it is, while making it more enjoyable with a wine bottle. Poems While Drinking Wine 14, on the other hand, mainly comments on how society behaves and how wine is a good addition to that acting. Immediately, Tao Yuanming sets the tone of the drinking conversation by suggesting that they sit on the ground, not beneath a pine tree, and not at some table or some gathering, but rather just simply with the earth. Immediately, the commentary on society begins. He suggests, after a few cups of wine, once venerable elders gabbing all at once and pouring from the bottle out of turn. These are people who are meant to act with dignity and civility, but a few wine and it immediately brings them down to the level of the regular common man. This dichotomy suggests that egos and hierarchies and societal placements all disappear when drinking wine. There is no more difference, and there's no judgment amongst others. Effectively, Tao Yuanming is saying that through wine, everyone is the same. It levels everything. This is the embodiment of Taoist purism. As long as you follow the Tao, all humans are the same. Effectively, Tao Yuanming brings up a point that is different than both Li Bai and Du Fu. He suggests that a society has created these norms and these values of which we're all meant to follow and agree upon. However, in more of an accordance with the Tao, this reclusive nature of life is more suggestive and leaning towards a correct way of living. And so wine is a way to remove those values that have been created by society in order to more truly follow the Tao. In other words, truly just a Stoic among Stoics, we should act as if society hasn't existed, if we were just living the pure life regardless. And this, of course, is the truth that he says exists in the taste of wine. This profundity is that we should act within accordance of the Tao regardless of the societal norms we've created, and wine allows us to do so. This brings us to the last two poets I will be examining, being Ruanji and Ji Kang, two of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove. The 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove were a group of Chinese scholars and poets, as well as some musicians, primarily from the Wei and Jin dynasties. They were renowned for their rejection of Confucianism and most societal norms of the time, and instead rather decided to live off in the bamboo groves in Nanjing. As such, we can rightfully expect they were strong followers of the Taoist principles. Let's start off with Ruanji. To represent Ruanji, I've chosen 2 selections from his Jiuhuang, Drunken Ecstasy, which is a lyric poem written about really truly embracing the Taoist mentality and what it means to do so. We can immediately see he delves straight into sad feelings or wasted pain. The cure for sadness is, of course, to call for wine. These are directly agreeing with the principles of Du Fu, which are to escape from the world with wine, to use it as a coping mechanism to cure your sadness. Immediately, this is supplemented with more Taoist principle, to act like a vagabond who drinks. He once in the hills, he forgets all big news. It is such a bliss to cruise the land of booze. He's saying with his drink, he wanders more to truly embrace the Taoist imagery, which is kind of relating back to Li Bai. So here we see both Li Bai and Du Fu in the same sense of Ruanji. However, we see even further Tao Yang Ming principle. When drunk all day, bad manners are fine. Here again, brings us right back to how egos and hierarchies, as well as manners, dissipate through your wine. Then he ends the second verse with growing wings, becoming divine, gaining the way happily with wine. So here we see wine is being used to truly finalize the supplement of Taoist imagery. Wine helps you wander to gather the way and leave your cares of society behind. The second poet I'll be discussing from the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove is Ji Kang. Specifically, his writing, The Ballad of Chu Hu 4. Ji Kang is an interesting one because though he too is one of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, he doesn't approve of drinking wine for any of the same reasons as others. So we see when tolling one's spirit leads to harm, indulging one's desires in the utmost decay, he's saying clearly, I still believe in these Taoist principles, do not fret too much on things you can't control, but also don't indulge in such things as wine. He continues further, those who abandon their bodies to dissipation, none will not depart early. Wine and women, what are they? Wine and women make one decay. Evidently, he does believe that one shouldn't toil their spirit or fret too much, like the rest of these poets, but he also believes that dissipation, which in this case is drinking and sexual indulgence, shouldn't be a part of this separation from hardships and societal norms, which he clearly states. This potentially makes him the only Taoist poet that doesn't approve the consumption of wine. This unfortunately brings us to the end of the poets I studied for this discussion, although I'm sure I will be looking into this more. In summary, the following themes are the ones that I felt stuck out the most across all of the poets I've studied. They are as follows. Probably the largest usage of wine across the board for these poets was Taoism, whether it be Li Bai, Tao Yang Ming, Ruanji, or Ji Kang. All of them explained how wine was a crucial aspect of their ability to carry out their own beliefs in Taoism, whether it be Li Bai and being exuberant about any aspect of nature and be accepting things while also making them in a positive light, or whether it's Tao Yang Ming and his ability to just accept things at face value, moving on from any woes and potential controls of the real world, or whether it's Ruanji and his ability to escape to the hills and forget about the woes of life through wine, or his ability to forget the societal manners that are called for through wine and just accept the Tao. Or even for Ji Kang and his ability to say, Well, I don't believe that wine is a key aspect of how we can interpret the Tao. We should feel doubt anyway. Well, he uses wine there to explain the truth behind the Tao rather than just saying wine is a way to act like you understand it. Transcendence was also a major theme we touched upon throughout these poets. While it was definitely the largest in Li Bai in his first Drinking Alone in the Moonlight, it certainly doesn't fade when we hit to Ranji and his saying, oh, well, this wine makes me higher and higher towards the divine. They're saying, oh, this wine is allowing me to become one with the Tao around me and the nature, and I'm transcending human possibility to become one with nature. Finally, getting back to Du Fu, we see how escapism is a major aspect of wine and how wine is used in poetry to escape all the pain and the torment that exists within life, specifically often referring to death and the passing of time. We see with Du Fu and the An Lushan Rebellion that there's a lot of pain and torment, and that his poetry and his wine are his escape from such a thing. Or you could see it alternatively as his emotional release, which is a massive practice on the cultivation of emotional control. In order to find release, wine helps him to regain his emotional control. Lastly, we see wine appear quite frequently as a symbol for immortality and youth. While it appeared most prevalently in Li Bai's Before a Cask of Wine, it served fairly consistently as an indicator of immortality and youth, whether it be through its characteristic of being unfazed by time, or its ability to remove the woes of old age. Thank you very much for hearing out the discussion. I look forward to continuing it next time.